The book in review today is Nudge by Richard H. Thaler and Cass Sunstein. I will be embedding one free copy of this book somewhere in this recording, so hopefully you can grab a free copy for yourself. I think Nudge is best summarized in an example that the authors use in the book. In Amsterdam, there was an airport where a black fly was painted onto the urinals, and this was estimated to reduce spillage by up to 80%. Just as the fly was able to correct for bad aim or a lack of interest in aiming, nudging is also able to correct for human biases. It is the idea that human behavior can be influenced ever so subtly in such a way that optimizes for better decisions. As the others argue, whether we are making decisions about ourselves or about other people, we always find ourselves either as choice architects or as the target of choice architects. A choice architect is someone who is coming up with strategies that can be used to influence decisions. If you are a store clerk who is organizing your desk or maybe your food shelf, or you are an individual who is trying to plan how your room is set up, or whatever it may be, we have to create an environment that requires some decisions to be made by those who are going to participate in that environment. A lot of the work in Nudge was inspired by Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel laureate and behavioral economist who championed the idea that human beings are fallible and our biases greatly affect the choices that we make. And oftentimes these choices are not necessarily in our best interest, even when we want it to be. And more crucially, even when we think they are. Kahneman talks about two systems, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is our impulsive, spontaneous, unreflective system. System 2 is a system that incorporates more rational thinking, more slow, methodical, and reflective analyses of choices that we need to make. When these two systems start to interfere with each other, we start to have these biases that need nudges to be corrected for. Essentially, we don't want to be deliberating and analyzing and thinking through situations that call for quick, decisive actions, like, say, someone is attacking us. And on the other hand, we don't want to be too hasty in our decisions when we need to make complex decisions like deciding on a new career or finding a spouse. The problem is that it's not always easy to determine which situation we're in and which system we need to employ to solve problems and make decisions with. By understanding how human behavior and biases can be improved, we are able to develop better systems when it comes to optimizing choice for both ourselves and for other people. And we're also able to notice sludge, which is basically things that make it difficult to make good decisions. One of the more intriguing and common ways in which humans are biased is through social influence. As we all know, it doesn't take much peer pressure to get people to do things that they might otherwise not do, whether that's in their best interest or not in their best interest. Moreover, social influence is not limited to just actions we take, but beliefs that we have as well. Social influence is by no means the only bias talked about in this book. In fact, there are so many others like availability bias, anchoring, representativeness, loss aversion, following the herd, which is the same as social influence. But if you're intrigued by how biases can be exposed through experiments in interesting ways, I would highly recommend you pick up a copy of this book. So all of that can fall under the category of why we need to be nudged. The book also dives into when we need to be nudged and tries to condense these possible context into just a handful. So I want to read a list of situations in which the book recommends nudging is appropriate. Quote, the discussion thus far suggests that people may most need a good nudge for choices that require memory or have delayed effects, those that are difficult, are infrequent, and offer poor feedback, and those for which the relationship between choice and experience is ambiguous. End quote. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but let's try to reify them a little bit more with a couple of examples. So the first one about choices that require memory. We can think about taking our medications, for example. We might forget to take our medications, and a good nudge for that would be something like setting an alarm clock or asking a friend as a reminder. Then we have choices that have delayed effects. This one, I think, requires some juxtaposition to really illustrate the point. So assume we have someone shooting a basketball and a surgeon. What is the difference between these two activities? Well, the person shooting the basketball has two benefits that the surgeon doesn't have as far as improvement goes. The basketball shooter has frequency and feedback. So they are able to shoot the basketball quite a bit more times than the surgeon is able to perform any given surgery during the course of, a day or a few years or whatever. So that's one count in which the basketball shooter is able to get more practice. Another count is the feedback. For each shot the basketball shooter takes, they are getting prompt feedback as to whether it was a good shot or it wasn't a good shot. And as such, they're able to adjust their technique versus the surgeon who is incapable of getting such immediate feedback. In fact, it might take, anywhere from a day to a year or even more to figure out if the surgery was a successful one. So we can analogize from these examples a little bit and think of how certain activities offer more frequency, other activities might offer more feedback, others might offer both, and yet others might offer neither. The stock market, for example, is a context in which we might get good opportunities, but we're not getting good feedback because, when exactly are we measuring this feedback is another question to ask in that case. But we can see that the more frequency feedback and the more predictable the environment is, the better we are able to improve. And the less of that we have, the more beneficial nudges become in guiding our decision. If all that sounds too convoluted, perhaps an easier way to think of situations in which nudging is appropriate is to think about investment choices versus temptation choices. Investment choices are the choices that we make now and benefit from in the future. And temptation choices are the choices that we enjoy now and regret in the future. We can probably think of so many examples of these. For investment choices, we can think of investment. We can think of eating healthy, exercising. These typically require more of a nudge because it's harder for us to commit to, and they tend to operate more on our system two, which is the thoughtful, analytical side of our brains to implement, versus temptation goods, which are things like overeating an ice cream bowl or binge watching a TV show when we should be, studying. Those actually don't require any nudge at all. And in fact, we might want to do things that curtail our impulse to indulge in those activities. So we've talked about what nudging is, why we need to nudge, when we need to nudge. Now let's move on to how to nudge. While the authors go into detail about several ways to go about nudging, it all really boils down to two things: make it fun and make it easy. I'm sure this is not a revelation to anyone that things that are fun or easy or fun and easy are things that people gravitate to. This can come in the form of curating choices by narrowing it down to a few simple choices that people prefer, or just being more transparent about the choices available and making it clear what experience accompanies each choice. My overall impression of the book was that nudging is a difficult concept to pin down because it overlaps with a lot of other forms of influence that might not be desired, like coercion and manipulation. And the line is not always very clear. The others do a great job trying to distinguish it, but they still acknowledge that there are those situations that it's really difficult to pin down the difference between one or the other. For example, the whole idea that nudging is meant to influence people to make decisions that are in their best interest, one might ask, what is people's best interest and who is to decide what that best interest is? So as you can tell, it gets very complicated very quickly. But those are more isolated contexts in which nudging becomes complicated. In most contexts, nudging is very straightforward because it's easy to make that assessment as to what is most beneficial to the people making that decision. What I didn't like about the book is that towards the end, it focused heavily on investments, mortgages, insurance, credit cards. And while I'm not necessarily opposed to financial topics, it was a little more bland than the other parts of the book that talked about human behavior. And that might just speak to my own interest in philosophy and psychology over, more mundane matters like finances. If you have questions like, can't bad people use the same tools to influence people? Or why can't we just educate people and maximize their choices as opposed to trying to nudge them one way or the other? Or maybe you're wondering why not just prohibit or mandate certain things as opposed to trying to nudge people. Then I highly recommend you read this book. I think you'll get a lot of value out of it. Similar books that I would highly recommend reading are Atomic Habits, which focuses more on an individual level of nudging to create for better habits. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and The Elephant in the Brain by Kevin Simler and Robin Hanson. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video with me, and I hope you stay tuned for my next review.